Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm Nick Borrego and this is Converge Audio. Today we have an interview for you with the composer of Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Gareth Coker. This soundtrack, it takes me on a journey, and I think you're going to find that you have the same experience as well when you listen to it. The way that he writes, it doesn't stay in place. Everything continuously evolves, and I think you're going to really understand what I mean when you get the chance to hear it. And those of us who have played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So please hit us with a like and a subscribe. That definitely helps out. Those types of numbers are always helpful. So thank you for everybody that has so far. And without further ado, this is my interview with Gareth Coker. Gareth, it's excellent to have you on here. Thanks for coming on to Converge Audio.
Thanks, good to be here. My first time here as well. So look forward to getting into it.
I have to say that when I play games that have this kind of emotional power, I don't do well with them, and that's a good thing. It's the fact that it hits me so hard. That first sequence that I watched in the Blind Forest really was jarring and powerful to me, and yep. I'm excited to... I haven't been able to play Will of the Wisps yet, but I'm very excited to see and feel the gameplay. But I've listened to the soundtrack, and it's just the most progressing, traveling, emotionally powerful thing I've heard in a while. So let's talk about kind of how you take the story of Ori, convey that with such a cool, dynamic, and flowing type of sound.
The story for Will of the Wisps, obviously I'm not going to get into spoilers because I don't want to spoil you too much, but it's fine. First of all, it's a direct continuation from the end of Blind Forest. So that's kind of like a nice place to start. But I think one thing that we focused on pretty early was that we didn't want this game to feel like a quick sequel, like an Ori 1.5. We really wanted to make sure that it was a proper expansion of the original game. The whole game really got rebuilt from the ground up, and we're not just talking about the mechanics, like how Ori moves, how Ori walks, like the sound effects were remastered. All aspects of the game were looked at, and the question got asked is, how do we take what we had and improve it, but also be respectful to what we had originally and what fans fell in love with. And that was something that took a while to figure out, because it's not an easy question. We come out of nowhere, and because we came out of nowhere on the first game, I think we had a pretty big impact. Now this time around, we're not the unknown studio. Everyone knows who we are. Everyone knows what Ori is. So there's kind of a lessening of that initial impact. So it's like, well, how else can we make impact in a meaningful way? And so that's why everyone kind of had to look inwardly and kind of examine what we wanted to do. And you mentioned story, and that album is a long album. And various people have asked me, like, why is it so long? And I'm like, I didn't cut anything from what the player experiences while they're playing the game, that is, if they're on the golden path. Like, the only thing that's been cut from the soundtrack are a few like tracks that you basically you can miss pretty much, or that aren't important to the narrative. But those 60 tracks, if you feel like they have told a story, it's because that's how the game plays out. My approach to writing the Ori soundtracks is really to take a point of view, and that point of view is Ori. Like, what is the music that Ori might have in his head as he's going through the world? And I think this is a really obvious difference between the first and the second game. As you played the first game, you're obviously aware that we had the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, chase sequences. The first one being the Ginzo tree, the second one being the Forlorn Ruins, and they return in this game. Emotionally, for Ori, he's in a different spot when he's doing the chase scenes in this game. At least that was my feeling. A chase scene in this game, it's like, well, I've kind of done this before. Like that's what I think Ori would think. So the music in the chase scenes feels slightly less dangerous or tense. Don't get me wrong, there's still an intensity increase, but all of the chase music in this game, I think, at least the two of the cool ones, they're in the time signature of 3, which is more like a waltz, which is something that's a little bit lighter in feel, whereas the chase scenes in Ori 1 are all in 4, which is more square, more rigid. It's much easier, in my opinion, to build tension in 4, and 3 just feels more like a dance. And that, especially with the first chase sequence that you have in this game, I was like, that's a big difference, because I know people are going to be wanting to have like the same experience that they had when doing the chase scene, for the first chase scene in Blind Forest, but I'm like, narratively it's not the same chase scene, so playing the same music to me doesn't make sense. So that's like one like example of taking the core idea and evolving it as the story has changed from the first game to the second. And conversely, where we do have danger and fear and terror and all of that now, is with the boss fights. We have various boss fights with various creatures in the game, and that was not something that we had in the first game. We did have a couple of moments at the end where, you know, Kuro's chasing you or Kuro's stalking you, but it wasn't really a direct interaction. You know, this time the boss has HP and you've got to get it down to 0 to win. So that's a very, very different interaction than we've had before, and that Ori has had before. So that was where I was like, okay, we can really dial things up here and make sure that the player feels like, oh my god, this is really dangerous. Ori's in trouble. One of the cool things, and actually probably one of the things I'm most proud of in the score, is the dynamic aspect of the music in the boss fight. It's fairly simple, but I feel like some of the best music implementation is the stuff that's really simple but is executed well. And quite simply, when you get to halfway through the fight with a boss, that sets off a transitional cue, and that transitional cue moves into a more optimistic version of the same fight piece. And that's supposed to convey to the players like, okay, you're winning the battle and keep going. So whereas the first half of a boss fight is going to be, oh my god, what am I fighting? This is terrible. What do I do? It's scary. All of those kinds of emotions. The second half is, yes, I can do it. I can win. I can keep going. And I have to admit, you know, anyone who tells you that they're not looking, any creator who tells you that they're not looking at comments is lying. And I go onto YouTube and look at the comments on the Spider track, and the amount of people that have written is like, oh, I loved when the music changed because it helped me to keep going in what is quite a lengthy boss fight. I was like, okay, yes, it worked, and it's fairly simple, but this is the kind of thinking that was applied throughout the game. It's not something I really had to do. I think most people would have been just fine if there'd been a standard 2.5 minute loop that just plays until you beat the boss. But one of the things that the studio as a whole is very good at is making sure that good enough isn't like what gets in the game. They really push us to like think, is this like the maximum that you can do, or is there anything more you can do for this scene? And what I've described to you might sound fairly simple. It's like, oh, you just change the music when you're halfway through, but it's one thing to change the music, it's another thing to change it smoothly for every player, because a boss fight is going to play out differently every single time. And in the first game, we would not have had the technical support to do that, but this time around we did. We had all kinds of implementation support in the music that was really able to help me place the music as the story developed in a much more granular way than Blind Forest. So it was just kind of nice to have that technical aspect to draw on. So I could basically be like, I want the music to do this, this, and this, and then the implementation team could be like, okay, we can do that, and then I would just come back to the game in like a week or two, and I'm like, there it is. Very, very lucky to have an implementation team at all, because it's not something that is that common.
I think that the most impressive bit, and going back to when you mentioned that it's people have told you it's a long soundtrack, I think with a soundtrack like this, it sounds kind of tacky to say, but the longer the better. And the reason I say that is because you don't really feel like it's staying in place. And I think this suits what you're talking about with a boss fight working out in the context of what Ori is developing. He's on this adventure, he's traveling, he's experiencing all these amazing, spectacular situations, and the artistry behind it and the sheer beauty of everything. There's not really a stagnation in what I see in this game at any point. And so I love that you've emphasized how do we just continue this progression and this travel in this story. And do you think a lot of that has to do with the implementation team, or do you think maybe some of the story development was helped by the fact that you guys kind of worked more in tandem on this one than as opposed to Blind Forest?
I work pretty closely with the story and the animation and narrative team pretty much throughout development. I think this one, just because the story is a little bit more involved, there was a lot more back and forth. But that's not to say there wasn't on the first one. I just think the first one was the setups were just a little bit simpler. And it's funny, just thinking about the soundtrack for a second. My feeling, I'm in self-evaluation mode now because I've obviously finished these two games. My feeling about the first one is that there are certain tracks that people are drawn to, that are far away, like drawn to than. Sorry, my English is terrible this evening. That they are drawn to more than others, and it's because this might sound ridiculous to say, but it's like I feel that there's I wouldn't say there's filler, but like there's definitely the low intensity tracks are so low intensity on Ori and the Blind Forest that they really set up the moments that really need to hit home. Whereas I feel like the journey on this game is a little bit faster paced. We throw a lot more at the player. It's a little bit more of a the roller coaster is moving at a quicker speed, if you get what I'm saying. Just as a very basic comparison, in the first game, you have to play for a long time before you even get double jump. You get wall jump pretty early, but you don't get double jump until for a new player, it's going to be a good 2.5 hours into the game. In this game, you get double jump after I feel like it's 30 minutes. So we just increased the pacing of the game in general, because I think most of us feel that the opening 3 hours of Ori 1, while strong, there's quite a lot of dead space there. But this time you're getting a new ability, you're getting to go into a new environment, you're getting a cutscene, you'll hear a new music track, you'll encounter a new monster. There's something new being kind of thrown at you all the time, right honestly up until the end of Act 2, which by that point you've probably been playing for 8 to 10 hours. And yeah, I think one of the things about the implementation is I am the one that decides how the music will be implemented. The implementation team is really just following my instructions. So what happens is I basically play the game. I write the music according to a video recording of myself playing the game, so I can get in the right mindset when I'm writing. Then I export that same video and I overlay my music with how I want it to play out in the game, and I send that along with a PDF to the implementation team. And then they just do it, and if the implementation is terrible, then I usually hear back from the director or someone else who thinks it's no good. So the back and forth in Moon Studios, because we're a distributed studio and everyone's kind of connected online, it's fairly constant. It's one of the It's one of the best things about the studio is that there's easy access to everyone. That can be grating at times because it's like, oh man, I just want to focus on work. But
Yeah.
yeah, you definitely have to turn off notifications if you're working at Moon Studios, or at least I do. I dive into the communications when I'm feeling like it. But it's good because you can get answers to questions very quickly. Like if I have a question about a cutscene, I can get the answer really quick. If I have if someone has a question about like, oh hey, do you have any music that would be appropriate for this cutscene that I'm just blocking out and sketching right now, but I just want some temp music to get inspired, I can either pick them a temp track from a pre-existing soundtrack, though I don't usually do that, or I can just go through like my own album, all of the stuff that I've written, and be just like, oh yeah, just try this, it'll probably work for the basic emotion that you're looking for this cutscene, and then I can tweak it and start to write to it when you're done with it. There's just a lot of back and forth that I don't think you necessarily get in a big studio. A lot of the big studios are very compartmentalized. As a composer, I've worked for a couple of big studios in the last year, so I do have some experience with this. I can't say who, but things are compartmentalized, and you don't get the hardcore access that, for example, in the film world, the composer and director relationship is usually pretty tight. It's quite an important relationship, but in a lot of in some of these big games, it's like, am I going to ever meet the director? Maybe once or twice at the beginning, but like games are made in a slightly different way. But because I'm a composer that plays the game a lot, it means I can talk about the game and every aspect of it with pretty much anyone on the team. And I bring that up because I don't have an 100% record of this, but like I can usually guess when a game I've been working on whether the composer has played the game or not, because there is something to be said for like how music flows within the game and how it is implemented. And if it's implemented well and with care and with thought by like how it flows with the gameplay, with the art, and with just the overall story that you're trying to tell, games like that immediately stand out to me because I think you feel it almost from the opening titles. Whereas games that just have had there are games which do have really bad implementation, but because the music's so good, you can kind of ignore it. But generally speaking, that like I'd rather have both, but I'd rather have amazing music be in the game. And if there's something that's not quite right, well, at least the music was still there. And implementation could be tweaked in a patch, but once you've recorded the music, you can't really change it. So because you've obviously committed. So that's obviously you want the combination of two. And on Ori and the Will of the Wisps in particular, we really had the most amazing support for getting the music into the game and playing back in the way that I wanted it to. With it being a Metroidvania, these games are so incredibly complicated because if you move one thing around, it affects another 5 million things. And so things break all the time, even with the music implementation, but we were able to get enough testing done to make sure that all of the cues play back in the right place. I hadn't realized how much stuff there is to think about on the implementation side. Like, what happens if the player presses pause? Does the music stop or does it continue? What happens if they go into a menu? What happens if they alt tab out of the game in Windows and then they come back in? Like, there's all of these parameters. Whereas I'm just like, oh, can the music start and stop in the right place? And then it's like, there's a bit more to it than that, actually.
Do you think that that's a big part of why when I listen to the soundtrack, it doesn't feel very loopy? It doesn't feel very textural, where it has there's the textural approach that I feel like a lot of composers do, where they create a mode and they build on that, and It kind of builds and swells and stays in that zone. Whereas, maybe you see this differently, but when I'm listening to your work, I'm not really feeling like we're just sticking on one texture, one feel, or one mode. We're kind of just traveling. We're moving constantly. It's constant progression. So do you think that implementation had an influence on your direction with that?
There's there's two levels to that. So there's two levels to that answer. So the games that you're talking about, a lot of games are using the vertical structure, vertical layering. They just like, you have a core groove, and then when things get more intense, you pile on more stuff, and then when things get less intense, you bring things back. And it's a perfectly valid way of doing it. My problem with that is, unless the game is right, it works really well in fighting games, like when you have a combo, or in racing games, like the faster you go, the more intense the music becomes. Makes total sense. But in games where you're moving around and you've got control over the experience, like in first person or third person, for me, it feels gimmicky when you use the vertical layering, because it's like, oh, look at me, I'm the music, and you're in combat now. It's just like, it's not great. I scored Ori entirely horizontally. So what you're experiencing both in the game and on the soundtrack, there's never ever anywhere which has vertical layering. In fact, the soundtrack was delivered with no stems. They literally just mixed the game with a stereo mix, which is pretty unheard of in games nowadays, especially games the size of Ori. Most games are delivering like a string section, brass section separate, percussion, like a bunch of stems. But I just delivered the full mixes, and they never even asked for stems, and the game sounds really, really, really. It's a great mix. Anyway, I wrote the soundtrack horizontally, and basically all that means is just that the music is changing according to whatever actions Ori has completed in the world. Now, as it pertains to the soundtrack and some of the cues that you've been listening to, we'll just take a boss fight as an example. The boss fight, More of the Spider, on the soundtrack is actually 5 cues glued together. It's the intro, which goes seamlessly into the first phase of combat, which goes into the transitional cue, which I mentioned earlier, which goes into the more optimistic phase of combat, which goes into the outro once you finish the boss fight. So that's actually 5 cues in the game, which is stitched together as one on the soundtrack, but also how it's presented on the soundtrack is largely how you will experience it in the game. So that's like one example of like where things, if you've probably felt like the soundtrack was constantly moving forward. That's basically what you've just said.
Yeah. And the best way possible. It's what I loved so much about it, is as somebody who hasn't been able to play Will of the Wisps yet, I was still getting some kind of progressing experience out of it. And I don't think every soundtrack I've ever heard actually does that all the time.
The other aspect to it is that most of the... So it's funny you mentioned that it didn't feel like loops, because actually several of the tracks on the soundtrack are literally just the loops with a little ending tacked on.
So they're big loops. They're long loops.
They're big loops. The shortest loop I have is like 3 minutes. I don't do short loops.
There you go.
So yeah, you like the one thing that's very, very important to me is like I cannot stand it with games which have short loops. The longer the track is, I mean, and you really don't have to write that much to get to a track to like be 3 minutes. But the thing I do, because it was taught to me when I was at music school, and you don't have to agree with this. People who are listening don't have to agree with this, but it makes sense to me. The best form and structure to write a piece of music in, or the most effective one, is the pop song.
All right.
And hear me out here. So a pop song has an intro,
mm-hmm.
then it has a verse, section A,
sure,
chorus, section B,
mm-hmm.
another verse, A2, another chorus, B2.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it has a bridge or like a breakdown section, and then you're just back to section A and B again. So like, you've already got your track structured, like if you listen carefully to a lot of the tracks on the album, you'll hear this. There'll be a melody presentation, and then there might be like one of those textural sections where nothing much happens, but it's kind of like a space where you can just enjoy the instruments or the palette that has been created, and then the melody returns. We're back to section A again. Most of my songs follow songs. I'm calling them songs, but really I should just call them tracks. Pieces, yeah. But most of my tracks do follow the song form structure in some way, a verse chorus structure, because it solves a lot of problems. It's like, oh, how do I extend this piece of music? Well, I can just use section A again and maybe modulate it or tweak the melody or something. And it actually, when a game has long loops, it's like, you don't need to write 3 minutes of like where the music is constantly changing. It's okay to have repetition if it's not constantly repeating. Like, you might hear the same thing within a 3.5 minute loop, but if it's bookended by something else completely different, it's not going to feel like it's repetitive. Whereas if it is just, a lot of the games with short loops, it might just be section A and B repeated over and over and over again in the same way, and you're going to feel that so fast. But when the loops are long, it allows you to structure a piece properly. In a format which for me makes sense to most people. I mean, we all listen to pop music or rock music in our lifetime at some point, and there's a reason why that structure is so popular, because it's very accessible. And the person who taught me this was the composer Christopher Young. And he's a horror music specialist. And even though he's doing all of this wacky, crazy horror music stuff, we would sit down in class with him and he'd give us the scores and he'd show us, like, this is the A section, the verse, this is the B section, this is the chorus. And you'd be hearing this like cacophony of sound. But once you start to know what to listen for, it's like, oh yeah, I can hear the verse. I can hear the chorus. And it's like, it's just that way of thinking has really stuck with me pretty much right from the beginning of my career. And I'm not saying write every piece of music that you ever write in pop song format, but it's like, if you've got, something over 3 minutes, it's definitely a good place to start. That was one of the best answers I've ever given, by the way. I'm like quite proud of that. That was.
I'm glad you gave it here, man.
That was like quite concise, quite good. Yeah.
Look, I think it's.
I've actually never addressed that really before. The whole, not in such detail, the pop song thing. That's.
It's new material to me.
There is a reason behind it.
Well, I think that's actually pretty insightful stuff. I've never heard any composer take that as an example of how you can structurally create your sound. I think a lot of the time, and I'm just as guilty of this as anybody, is if I hear a pop song, I'm so aware of that formula that I usually just kind of try to tune it out, or it's just passively hearing it in the background. I'm not really focusing on it.
Well, that's the thing, is if it is a formula, but when you put that formula in a genre where it's not where that formula is just not represented, it's going to sound new, or it's going to sound interesting. But yeah, I mean, you've listened to the soundtrack and said it sounds like a journey, but I can tell you that at least 70% of those tracks were structured like a pop song.
You've really focused on developing this songwriting, if you will, technique on how do you build that A section if it's represented again, the B, and a simple selection, a simple set of selections. You've found a way to continue to keep those fresh, but there is kind of like that skeletal for a foundation behind all of it. That's actually really surprising because, like I said before, if I didn't know that you did that, I never would have thought, hey, I'm hearing a pop song structure here. I'm trained to hear that in pop music and in rock music. I'm a big fan of progressive metal because I don't hear that formula. But what I love is you've just now shown me that I actually can love that formula, and apparently I do because I love this soundtrack.
Right. It's not the case with every track. I mean, obviously the cutscenes just follow what's happening on the screen, but like it's especially the case with the ambient loops. It's like I want to get the player like kind of in a groove, because this game is so much about movement and motion and like just the freedom of movement. You've played the first one. Like when the game opens up and you have all of the abilities, I'm obviously biased, but I don't think there's a game on the planet where you can move as well as Ori does. Certainly not in the 2D realm. There's other games that do other things better than Ori does, but like with the movement thing, the game really gives you so many ways to move around, and it's just like I want to make sure that the player like really feels that in the music. And see, the thing about pop music or rock music is it can involuntarily get you tapping your foot, whether you like it or not. If I go to some awful nightclub, which does not happen anymore, but let's just say I did, I'm going to go and, you subconsciously start moving in time with the music. It's just something that we're programmed to do. And I'm not saying like rock out while you're playing Ori, but like the thinking behind it is like just getting the player into a zone where they feel, this sounds kind of corny, but where they feel at one with the game. That comes from the gameplay and the sound and music and the art and like all of it working together. Like the music's role when it's just doing the regular gameplay loops is to make the player feel fully connected with how Ori's moving. And that's the other reason why I play the game so much, is because I want to make sure that I'm getting that feeling when I play it. It's because it's very important to me.
I think the system you guys have going there for you to be able to play it along, it to me, I feel like more studios would benefit greatly from following that kind of relationship. The distance of you and the director doesn't make any sense to me.
It's getting better. It used to be the case that it was quite difficult to get access. Obviously, with indie games, it's pretty easy, but like the big studios are getting better at opening up their dev process and like getting the. I think for a lot of studios, it's like they're not used to. There is a thinking right now that the composer should just compose and like we'll take care of the rest of it. But I'm like, there is a unique thing that can happen when the composer is so deeply connected to whatever they're working on. Whereas if the composer is working in isolation from the project, it is harder for them to connect to the material that they're working on. And again, I speak from experience on this because I have all access on Ori, and on other projects I haven't been given all access, and it's not quite and you can still make it work because usually on those big projects they have like a massive team like putting together your music and making sure it's placed well in the game. So you can definitely have an amazing audio and music experience without being connected to the game. But I think there are some composers, I'm one of them, where you might get that little bit extra when they have access to the game and are able to play it and really understand, really put themselves in the feet of what the player might be doing. That's something that is really important to me, though it is obviously very labor intensive, especially when games these days are getting so big. I mean, Ori's still would be considered a small game, but it's still going to take you a good 10 to 12 hours to finish.
Has some of your input influenced any rewrites or restructure to any specific parts of the game where they thought, hey, we could do this even better? Or have there been any changes that they made along with that process?
I'm gonna cite there's a lot of it's like I'll give some feedback and it might kick off a conversation, but there is a very specific change in Will of the Wisps that I'm probably safe in mentioning. So because it's a relatively small change, but for me it made a big difference. So there's a section in the game called the Watermill. You get inside and you get locked in this room with some monsters. You have to fight them, and then you move to the left. You get to the room you were trying to originally go to, and then that room is now a dead end, and you go back through the room with the monsters, and then more monsters appear. I'm just like, can we just get rid of these monsters? Because we just literally had a fight in this room with some monsters. We don't need to have that again. There's already plenty of combat in the game, and it disrupts the flow for the player of getting to the next objective, which they got in that dead end room.
Yeah.
And I brought that up, and they were like, "Why is this so important to you?" And I'm like, "Because it disrupts the flow." And it was funny because the designers, they couldn't really see it, and I'm like, "Just trust me on this. Like, you don't want to disrupt the flow, and we don't need to experience the same thing again." And then they took it out, and it was like, oh, okay, yeah, we don't miss those monsters. And of course, deleting a monster is just like two button presses, so it wasn't like a complicated change. But it was just like there's a lot of like little moments like that where it's not just me that makes these kind of small suggestions. Like a lot of people on the team give their feedback constantly, and it means a lot of parts of the game had a lot of eyeballs on them. So yeah, that's just like a small example of where I was able to have a small effect on the small but very real effect on the game.
Look, I think that says a lot about how cohesive the whole experience is. What I've gathered from Ori, from what I've been able to play, what I've been able to see, is the imagery, the progression of the story, the gameplay mechanics, and the audio implementation, the way it all comes together. I think that kind of thing can only really come from a team that has that kind of relationship and that kind of communication line and a little bit of that respect and kind of artistic perspective in seeing where everybody is trying to go. It's kind of the definition of what collaboration should be. Yep. And clearly that's why Ori has become such a hit. Yep. And, good on you guys. I think it's an amazing process, it sounds like. It does make me curious, and obviously, there's always hey, what's next coming down the pipeline? But in this industry, we can never talk about what's coming next because it's to the marketing.
Well, especially now with the virus situation, all game companies have been forced to work from home. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the result of that is, because Moon Studios, we're all working from home anyway. The studio has been remote since the very beginning. I still think it's a miracle that we managed to ship 2 games with, several people hardly ever meeting each other at all. But I would like. It's a very unique experience. I would say sometimes it can be like a big family. It can get messy sometimes.
Sure.
But it comes from a place of love. Again, that sounds kind of cheesy, but like that really is what it is. I mean, there are some fierce arguments sometimes, but like there are in any family. But ultimately, it's because we care about the game that we're working on, and that it's really important to us. So people's you definitely have to have a thick skin working at Moon, because your work is up for appraisal by pretty much everyone on the team. But if you're built for that, then you're just like, you just shrug, and it's like, oh, I have to write more music to make it work. Oh, okay, well, that's the biggest problem I'm going to have today. Okay, that's fine.
And I suppose that you can understand the context of someone's criticism when you know that they're looking after the best possible result without them trying to be above you. It's more about that. I mean, it's corny to say, maybe some people would say, but there is a love that you can sense from a project where people are respecting each other and are appreciating each other's work and are on the same page. And I think that's why this game comes together so well.
I think you can tell that on almost all the games that come out that feel really good to play. You can kind of tell what games have like where everyone like really cared about the end product. I mean, one game that has really struck me, I haven't had time to play a huge amount of games, obviously, but one game that really struck me, and it's not perfect by any means, but I will remember this game for a long time. It's Control. Now Control has some janky combat, but there's so much going on in the game, I don't care. Like, I'm so immersed when I play the game, and I was just like, man, there's so much cool and weird stuff in this game that I just want more of it. And they did such a good job with the world building, and it's just a place where I want to spend more time in. Like, clearly a lot of love and care and went into that game, and there's a lot of detail work that makes the game really, really immersive for me. Control's another Metroidvania, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, personally speaking, I really enjoyed that game. And yeah, it's something. I think it's just something you can tell, like when a game has had much love put into it, and it was certainly the case on Will of the Wisps and Blind Forest.
And I know you've done some film work in the past as well, and your film experience compared to video games, have you been able to notice a difference, or if there's maybe a more intense collaboration and development with the video game? Because obviously they're two completely different types of mediums and development process. Do you feel like maybe you are able to flesh things out and develop things and create a more collaborative experience with a video game score? Or do you think some of the linearity in films, that some of those kind of that they share some similarities in that progression?
It's nice to have the controlled experience in film, like where you know that the person is going to experience it the same no matter what. But the thing is, that exists in games anyway, with all the cutscenes and stuff. It's something that we still get to do. I think the main difference is, I think generally with a film, you can start conceptualizing sort of while the film is in production, but until you really see a first rough cut, you can't do a great deal unless you've got a director who's willing to let you run with your concepts. Whereas in games, it's quite easy to get like 1 or 2 levels up and running, even with some art, so you can get a good feel for like, hey, this is what the game's going to be, in terms of the look, in terms of the sound, in terms of the gameplay. It's quite common to get that fairly early on. If we think back to E3 2018, we had a full build of the desert section of Will of the Wisps, and that's like a year and a half, almost 2 years before the game comes out. And so you you get a lot more opportunity for back and forth than you might on a film. Not to say that you don't get it on a film, but it's much more condensed. I think there's time to experiment on a game, which you might not always have the luxury to have on a film, unless your name is Hans Zimmer.
Yeah.
I think, if I look back to Blind Forest, I mean, Moon Studios took a chance on a guy who had one credit, like, to his name, and it was basically a student game. So, like, they said to me is like,
get things going.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I kind of lucked out there.
I'm sure it's going to continue, but it's an amazing way to debut.
Yeah, they gave me the chance to experiment, and the one thing that Moon is really, I mean, they're good at a lot of things, but like one thing that they're very big on is like, it's okay to fail. If you come up with something that you think is good, sure, submit it. We might not think it's good, but it's okay. Like, just go and do it again. They do encourage experimentation, and they do like encourage you to try things out that you might never have done before. And if it fails, well, so what? Life goes on. You won't get. Basically, they've always said you won't get you won't get fired for failing. As long as we see the effort. It's and improvement, obviously. So it's kind of a nice place to be. But especially on Blind Forest, when I was starting out and it's my first project, and I'm just trying to figure out how to ship 120 minutes of music. As things have developed now, it's like now I know how to do that and I've done it several times to a highly professional level. Now it's all about like how can we dial up the creativity even more, because I don't have the lack of knowledge that I had when I was starting out my career. I know how things are done now, and now it's all about like, okay, how can I improve and do something new?
It's excellent. I think to go on a concluding subject for this conversation, something that I think is useful to take for anybody who's listening to this, and obviously if they've played Ori and they're interested in game audio, then they've certainly checked out that soundtrack. What I would ask you is, what kind of advice would you offer up for some of these people that are perhaps they're just out of high school, they're looking to pursue university, or they're starting to get involved in films and games? Is there any specific, or I guess maybe even just general advice that you could provide for that kind of part in a composer's or any audio professional's career?
Yep. So the most important thing, in my opinion, is, this is going to sound like such a generic answer, but I'll go into a bit more detail, is do the work. So just to qualify that. All right. So I live in LA, and for every one person that does the work, there's 10 people who don't. And what I mean by that is, if I go to a party, at a party you meet all kinds of people, and we're in LA and everyone's working on something, but no one actually cares about what you are working on. They want to know, what have you finished? What have you done? That is a tangible thing that you can show people, and they can make an evaluation on it accordingly. What isn't interesting to me is like if I tell you right now, hey Nick, I'm working on like the most amazing video game, it's going to be the best thing of all time, like, you're going to be like, so what? It doesn't exist. Like, that might sound really interesting to you, but until I actually show you something tangible, it actually means nothing. Whereas if I say, hey Nick, would you check out this small cute indie thing that I worked on last year, there's a chance you're probably going to check it out, like, because it's a real thing and I just gave it to you.
Right.
So where that comes into when you're starting out is like, if you're starting out, you kind of don't have very much. So you've got to just get finished stuff out there. And when you might not even have like a film or a game. So where do you start? It's like, well, you've got that gigantic folder on your computer with idea 1 to 570, 683. Like, everyone has that folder. How about, like, instead of calling that idea 1, maybe call it finished idea 1. And then you have a complete track, and you can learn. The thing about finishing a track is it means you committed to something. And once you've committed to something, it means you can evaluate it. The other thing you can do is you can also sell it and make money, because if there's one thing that's really hard to do in this industry when you're starting, is make money. But I will say this, I think there's more work than ever before for media composers. Anyone who tells you otherwise is full of it. You just have to go and find it and use your imagination. The way I survived early on in my career, I uploaded tons of music to royalty-free marketplaces, and they still pay my rent. Because I was
Beautiful.
I was like, I was struggling, and I was like, oh wait, there's these websites, and then people would ask me like, why would you sell your music just for like $15 a license? And I'm like, well, it's now sold 4,000 times.
Right.
And then they go,
Big picture.
and then they go, right, and that's 4,000 times over 10 years. But like that's a decent amount of cash for something that I put online 10 years ago, you know? Like,
right. You're not even having to think about it now.
And it was
it's generating.
Yeah, it's and that track in particular, by the way, is literally just a percussion track.
Sweet.
And I can tell you, I did not spend a huge amount of time on it. So, you know, if you wanted to, there is literally no excuse for any composer starting out to like not be writing music every single day. Like, and if you don't know, you don't have to write like the big grand orchestral epic. Why not just write a 2-minute piano piece? Or why not practice your song form structure and write a 3 minutes 30 seconds piano piece? Like, do you get where I'm coming from? Like, it's much more attractive to like finish stuff. If you're a sound designer, you know, put together a reel of like finished sounds and say, you know, I'm working on this project. It's just, people aren't going to take you seriously until you have something tangible to show them. And where that benefits you down the line is if you have finished music tracks, like a finished album, like you're given someone to listen to, they might hire you in the future. It might be 3 or 4 years down the line. But the fact is you finish something and it proves that you committed to it. And if you were part of a team, like anyone who's worked on any game, whether it's the smallest student game or the biggest AAA project, it is so hard to get something across the finish line. And that's why people who are in the industry, who have seen that you have finished a shipped title, they are going to look to you again and again and again. There's a reason why the top composers get hired. It's creativity, but it's also, man, I can rely on that person to get the job done when it counts. And that is the most important mindset to get into from the very beginning of your career, is get the work done. Like, commit to it and don't overthink it. Because you need to get the work done on time and on budget. So like, learn to finish the tracks. It's the hardest thing to do at the beginning of your career because you want all of your music to be like the best thing ever, but that's just never going to happen. It is never going to be the best thing ever, but it has to be good enough so that you can release it into the world and move on, because that is what you will have to do when you start getting jobs, because you just run out of time. Like any game, you just run out of time to work on it. Any film, like, you can always make tweaks, but they run out. There's a release date. So it's a good habit to get into, and it's very attractive to other people who are doing the hiring.
Gareth, that's excellent advice, and I love...
That was good. I'm on form this evening. I should do more evening interviews.
I love it, though.
I can't give you a more thorough answer than that.
Look, I appreciate the directness of that. I like how it's more concrete of... You know, it's sometimes I think it's hard for people to kind of nail it down to a few specific principles, but you can't argue with the value of a finished product and an example and proof of commitment.
Yep.
So thank you for highlighting that, Gareth. And
no problem.
Huge thanks for coming on to my channel and talking about this incredible soundtrack. Is it available from major distribution platforms, or is there anywhere specific that we would recommend someone goes to find the soundtrack?
Will of the Wisps is available on pretty much whatever platform you use, even the super obscure ones. If you do want to listen to it in lossless quality, I know that's very important to people. It is available on Bandcamp, where you can download, I believe you can download the original 24-bit 48K WAV files. So
nice.
But if you're a streamer, it's on Spotify or Tidal, which also has the lossless audio, although I'm skeptical of what lossless audio in streaming actually means. But yeah, it's available everywhere. And if it's not, I'd be very surprised. If it's on something that's that obscure, then I'd be just like, well, move on to one that's less obscure. But yeah, every major distributor carries it, and the original soundtrack as well, and most of my other soundtracks. So yeah.
Well, fantastic. Everybody, if you've checked out anything from Ori, check out the rest of Gareth's catalog where you can find it. And yeah, just want to tell you thank you for coming on, Gareth, and thank you for the soundtrack. It's always a massive treat when we can just plug in, put on some earbuds or whatever we're going to listen to, and just go through a journey, and you've surely accomplished that with this soundtrack. And I think Moon Studios made a great choice with you, and I certainly look forward, and I'm sure everybody else does, to what the next Gareth Coker project is going to be. So until next time, this is Nick Borrego on Converge Audio, and Gareth, thanks once again.
Thanks so much, Nick.